Someone better call a hearse. I can see it all from here, from just a few glimpses. Now that light bulb's gone off and it's pulling my windsor. Now the light bulb's gone off. I've seen it in your eyes, I've seen you blankly stare, and I wanna show you how I love you, but there's nothing there. I'm not standing here. Oh, I'm not standing here. I'm riding in reverse.
Hey guys, so I take it that many of us, if not all of us, have been moved by some art at some point in our lives. So whether that be a song that you've listened to and maybe you return to, a movie, a performance in that movie, a painting, a poem or a story, whatever it may be that has moved you so, may have also in turn given you some kind of understanding, some kind of insight into life, into yourself. Even if you can't quite say what that insight is or understanding is, even if it's hard to describe, that this simultaneous being moved yet experiencing some kind of clarity is an interesting phenomenon that I'd like to talk a little bit more about today with this reading of Langer's. And the other reason I'm interested in this Langer piece as well, at least in terms of where we are in our unit, is how it might connect up with Camus. Camus talks about meaning trying to give unity to our lives, trying to uniform or unite ourselves with the rest of the world. And you do that by giving form to what is formless out there. And, he doesn't necessarily get into the nuts and bolts of what form is. And Langer here, Suzanne Langer, who again we've looked at it earlier in the semester, does give us an account, an analysis of how to think about form. Langer is trained in logic, and she early in her career spent a lot of time in logic, and we find her moving to questions of language and questions of art and the roles that symbols play in our lives, in the way we conceive the world and therefore perceive the world. So she is great for us, I think, in giving us a understanding of this notion of form. And in fact, her definition of art really ends up hanging on this notion of form. So let's look at what some of the key concepts that Langer gives us with respect to her theory, her view of art. So we have form, expression, creation, and I set aside human feeling. We'll get to that. In this video, we'll mainly start with form and expression. So what does she say on page 79? A work of art is an expressive form created for our perception through sense or imagination. So through your senses, right? You're taking it in through your eyes, your ears maybe, or your imagination. Maybe you're reading a book or a story, and so the images are appearing before your mind's eye, so to speak. And what is expressed is human feeling. And she has some ways of getting us to think about what that might mean. We'll get to that later, probably yes, in the next video, if not the video after that. So let's then start with form and how Langer approaches this. And a definition of form. And she refers to it as both logical form, sometimes as abstract form. So if I use any of those terms, logical form or abstract form, I'm meaning the same thing, just as she is. So she says form is a structure, an articulation, a whole resulting from the relation of mutually dependent factors. The way that the whole is put together, the way that whole arrangement hangs there, depends on each of its parts that are related to one another, right? They're mutually dependent. That is the form of the thing. So then she gives us this example, this perfectly great example of someone walking into a department store looking for a lamp, maybe for their apartment or their room, and she says, "Oh, they're all pretty hideous looking." Although I think some of these are Tiffany lamps, which are quite expensive, at least in this picture. So she says, "What do? You go in there and maybe you spot a lamp shade that you like, right? And you ask the clerk, though you like the shape of this thing, but you're not so crazy about the color or even maybe the size because you have a particular color scheme going in your apartment, and maybe you also need a smaller size lamp. So you ask the clerk, okay, do you have a lamp like this one, a lampshade like this one, but in a different color and in a smaller size?" And in this case, what you're really doing is something quite magnificent, Langner says. You don't realize it because we do it all the time, but it's really amazing how what we can do is look at an object out there in the world and say, all right, well, there's something there, and what I need is something similar to that object, even though I've never seen this other thing, right? I've somehow been able to extrapolate the things I like about this object and adjust them, reform them in a way, in my mind at least, to say, you know what, that's what I want, even though it's not here in the store. So when you think of, in this case, a very straightforward example of maybe the shape, the physical shape as the form, we're talking about the spatial factors of one object, the one object that you're pointing to in the department store here, that lampshade that exists there and the clerk is looking at, and you're saying, I need something like that with similar spatial factors that relate to one another in the same way, but I need it to be in a different color, or I need it to be on a different scale, a little bit smaller. So what you're doing is you're picking out the form, in this case the physical shape, and trying to convey to the clerk that you want something of the same form. All of these lampshades, physically speaking, have the same form, right? So that's a very straightforward, basic way of understanding form in the physical sense. But form goes beyond that. And the way we perceive form goes beyond that for Langner. So, here she says on page 80, what is the same in the big violet shade and the little green one? She says nothing but the interrelations among their respective various dimensions, right? Nothing but the form is the same. The interrelations among their respective various dimensions. Now, as I said, this example is just physical form, the physical shape, but for Langner, form extends beyond that in our lives. We are perceiving form in all kinds of ways. So I want to give you another example here that Langner doesn't use. So here is Memorial Hall, right, where we used to congregate together. And when you came to class on the first day, some of you may have had class in that classroom, Memorial 6110, I believe the room is. And so you may have been familiar with that classroom. You may have been familiar with the layout. But some of you may have not have had class in that classroom. And some of you, in fact, may have not even had class in Memorial Hall. But what's interesting is that when you came into class the first day, you looked around, you took everything in, and you didn't get confused. You didn't get, in such a state where you didn't know what to do or how to navigate or how to behave in the situation. you saw that, okay, on one end of the room there are these projector screens, and there's this computer there, and a lectern of sorts, and you said, okay, well, that's probably where the instructor is going to go. And then, you saw these tables or desks and these chairs in rows, and you said, all right, well, that's probably where I go. And so you found yourself a seat, and you behaved in such a way as you would on your first day of class as a student. And what happened here for Langer is that you were able to read the form of the space. That you came in and you immediately grasped, intuitively, where you were, what the situation was for you. Even if you've never been there before and you've never been in that classroom, what you've done is you've recognized the formal elements of the environment that you're in. You've been in an environment similar, and so you've extrapolated the form of previous experiences in classrooms, and you've applied it to this situation. And you said, okay, now I know how to behave. Now I know what to do. It's so immediate in your cognition. You're not having to really consciously go through step by step. Oh no, what do I do? Where am I? It's an immediate perception that this form is similar to other experiences I've had, and so I'm going to behave as I would in those other experiences. So it enables you experiencing, or rather perceiving the form of a certain setting, or a certain environment, whether that be physical or social or organizational, allows you to navigate that environment a bit more smoothly. You kind of read how to behave. You abstract from your past experiences to make sense of your present, even though the present is made up of different things that you've never actually seen before. What's interesting, I think, too, is now that we had to move online for our learning, is that many of us haven't had that past experience. Yeah, we've obviously had past experiences with, let's say, being online, and maybe we've watched, videos and took, some lessons online here and there, but we've never really had a full-blown semester online with many classes. And so that experience was quite new for many of us, still is quite new for many of us, and we're still trying to navigate it. And a part of that has to do with us not having a past experience that we can easily extrapolate the form of and apply to this experience, because that would allow us, that would make things a little easier to kind of, find our way in. If we had that ability to recognize certain formal and structure features immediately, we may have had a smoother ride in our transition. So this experience, quite new, quite different. And maybe if you end up taking classes online in the future, this experience will inform that experience for you. It will give you a kind of structure that you're used to, and you can recognize and understand how to kind of proceed in. So we're perceiving form all the time in our lives, Langer thinks, and this is quite a magnificent thing that we do. Now, we've been mainly talking about static forms of things that stay in one place or are stable. So the lampshade, right? That's not moving. That's just a thing in the store that is not in motion. Or the classroom itself is not really moving, right? All the desks and tables and chairs, that's all just there. But what about something like a waterfall? Well, Langer says this has dynamic form. The waterfall has dynamic form, and by that she means it's a form of motion, that there are forms of motions in life out there, in the world, on page 81. Waterfalls are one of them. She says on page 81, a waterfall seems to hang from the cliff, waving streamers of foam. Actually, of course, nothing stays in midair. The water is always passing, but there is more and more water taking the same paths. So we have a lasting shape made and maintained by its passage, a permanent dynamic form. So each water molecule is kind of disappearing, moving on, yet the pattern there can be perceived, right? The same pattern there can be perceived as something permanent or semi-permanent in this case. So waterfalls have dynamic forms. So do, for instance, rivers, right? Though the waters are rushing by, and as Heraclitus says, if we recall, you can't really step into the same river twice. Well, I think Langer might take a little issue with Heraclitus. And she said, yes, the waters are always changing, but the form of the river more or less stays the same. That the pattern itself stays the same, and that water is always being replaced so that we have an image, a perception of something there that is continuous. We might say that rush hour has a certain form, right? All those cars on the road, moving along together. They're different cars, but the cars are in a sense replenishing themselves, or we are at least in our comings and goings, replenishing that movement from work to home, from home to work, whichever way it may go. People getting on the interstate, people getting off the interstate, people making right turns, left turns, hitting stop signs, hitting red lights. All that movement together, kind of going, has dynamic form. You can just kind of imagine each hour of the day, each rush hour of the day, certain times, certain cars, reenacting the same kinds of movements. Sports, often we can look at as having dynamic form. The game of soccer, a kind of fluid, ever going, activity where players are constantly moving, shifting, rearranging themselves. The ball itself always moving. So there are certain patterns that we can kind of pick up and address, and we can talk about formations, right? The way the players are on the field and how they approach the game. There are certain patterns that we can pick out as being there continuously, yet still constantly be moving and shifting. And really, life itself has this dynamic form, which we will look at more closely when Langer talks about how art and life relate through form. So if you recall, a couple of, weeks ago now, when we were talking about Camus, and I ended with a slideshow of this artist here, Alberto Giacometti, and Giacometti in his study, in his studio, working at sculpture. And here is his wife, Annette. It's someone who he would day after day attempt to sculpt. And we can think of what he was doing as attempting to give her form, to capture her form in some way through this clay, with his hands. Over and over and over again, he did this in his life. There's many sculptures of Annette. So this is maybe a more straightforward example of someone trying to replicate the form or recreate the form of someone else. You might say the physical form, but also maybe the psychological form. Like what is she thinking? What is she expressing herself through her body, through her facial expressions that Giacometti might capture in his artistic rendering of her in this sculpture. So logical form here, remember, is that structure, articulation, the whole resulting from the relation of mutually dependent factors, the way that whole is put together. And so here you might say what Giacometti is doing is trying to recreate that whole in a different material. So we'll pick up here because this leads us into the next important concept, which is expressive form. And in the next video, that's what we'll go after.